Hello. Hi. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Good evening. And I'll have my guests sit down first, but great turnout tonight. All right. Well, welcome everyone to Politics and Prose. My name is Isa, and I'm a bookseller and the subscriptions coordinator here at PNP, where we now host in-person and virtual events along with trips, classes, and subscriptions, all of which you can check out on our website at politics-prose.com. So before we get started, I would like to do some housekeeping. First of all, please keep your cell phones and other devices silent just to avoid disrupting the event. Second, when we get time to opening the floor for your questions, we have placed a standing microphone at the end of the aisle to your right, over there. So please speak into the microphone so that everyone can hear your question, and we want that question to be heard in our recording of the event. Following the Q&A, we will have a signing up here at this table. So if you have not already purchased the book, we have many copies behind our registers at the front of the store. We will ask you to line up starting at the pillar, and we will come by to ask your name for personalization, so please have your books ready for us. Once the event is complete, we will kindly ask you to please fold up your chairs and lean them against something sturdy. So without further ado, tonight I'm excited to welcome Helen Benedict and Jacki Lyden, where they'll be talking about Helen's new book, Map of Hope and Sorrow, Stories of Refugees Trapped in Greece. Together with Syrian writer and refugee Eyad Awwadawnan, Helen presents the stories of 5 refugees who have endured long and dangerous journeys from the Middle East and Africa to Greece. These are compelling first-person stories of resilience, suffering, and hope, told in a depth rarely seen in nonfiction. The women and men in this book tell their stories in their own words, retaining control and dignity, while revealing intimate and heartfelt scenes from their life. Helen Benedict is a recipient of the 2021 Penn Jean Stein Grant for Literary Oral History and the Ida B. Wells Award for Bravery in Journalism. She is the author of 13 books, including the award-winning The Lonely Soldier, The Private War of Women Serving in Iraq, and a play, The Lonely Soldier Monologues. Her writing inspired both a class action suit against the Pentagon on behalf of people sexually assaulted in the military, and the 2012 Oscar-nominated documentary, The Invisible War. She is a novelist and professor of journalism at Columbia University in New York. Helen will be in conversation with Jacki Lyden. Lyden was an award-winning journalist for NPR for over 30 years. In 1997, Jacki published Daughter of the Queen of Sheba, a critically acclaimed memoir which chronicles her life growing up in the presence of her mom's profound mental illness. She is a recipient of the Rosalind Carter Fellowship for Mental Health Journalism and won the grand prize from the National Mental Health Foundation for a series on the incarceration of the mentally ill in Montana. Jacki is at work on a new memoir, Tell Me Something Good, which frames how life can change in a moment. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Helen and Jacki to PNP.
So thank you. It's so wonderful to be here with my friend Helen, who I admire so very greatly. Welcome to DC. You made it down, you and Stephen. Map of Hope and Sorrow, the first thing I want to say is a number of people in this room, and many of us, have interviewed refugees and people in extreme situations. I said in a Facebook post, I thought that this book sort of looked at them as if they were Chaucer's Pilgrims and Canterbury Tales, only sadly from hell, Just, it's so granular and vivid. Thank you. So why, of all the things you've done, you've always looked at people in extremists, it seems to me, if we're talking about female soldiers. I want to tell our audience a few facts about refugees, which even someone like myself, I'm a former Middle East correspondent, been to a number of camps, not these current ones, that this book reminded me of, because of course all of us get distracted by lots and lots of things in this world. 84 million refugees on planet Earth right now, more than at any time since World War II, right? About 6 million people have left Syria, and that doesn't even count the internally displaced, and that would be since the outbreak of the Civil War in 2011. 55,000 refugees in Greece alone from the Middle East and North Africa. So Helen, you picked quite the topic to wade into. So I suppose the first question is, I know you're formidable, but how did this happen?
Well, first, I just want to say welcome, everyone. I see a lot of familiar faces, former students, friends, and which is why I've been sitting here grinning, because it's so good to see you. I first went to the island of Samos in the northern Aegean in Greece in 2018 for a couple of reasons. I was researching a novel I wanted to write, and I was chasing, if you like, Iraqi refugees, because I'd written a lot about the Iraq War and the aftermath of the Iraq War, and I'd including novels about Iraqi refugees who landed here, and I figured that a lot of them would have been doubly displaced because so many fled to Damascus and other places in Syria in particular, and then when the civil war there broke out, they had to flee again. And I knew that there were these camps, these island camps, especially everyone knew about the one in Lesbos at the time. But there's another island near Lesbos called Samos, which also had a refugee camp on it, and most journalists were ignoring that one because it wasn't as big. So I decided to do what I always tell my students to do, which is to go where everybody else isn't going. So I went there and quickly found out that not only were Iraqis there, but mostly Syrians. And then as the years went by, more and more people from different African countries as well. And that, in fact, Samos was in many ways even worse than Lesbos because it was smaller but more overcrowded. And there was a point where it was the worst refugee camp in the whole of Europe.
That is truly extraordinary. And these people, I just want to paint a little picture of Syria before the civil war. I used to be based in Jordan. A beautiful place, full of classic places like Palmyra and the windmills of Hama and the citadel of Aleppo, places that have been, sorely hit by this. And I had no idea that so many people had wound up on these islands. And you paint this picture, maybe you could help me describe it a little bit, of here these refugees are in something that would look like a Regent's Cruise ad, but they're in camps, they're in containers, they're in almost unthinkable conditions.
So the camp is built on a former military base on the side of a mountain. It was built the base was built for 648 people. When I got there were 3,000 people living there, and it ballooned in a few years to 8,000 people. Inside the camp, it's seared into the side of the mountain. There are rows of white shipping containers, the metal boxes you see on the backs of trucks, lined up the mountain, and between them, thousands and thousands of tents crammed into every inch, spilling all the way over inside the camp, which is surrounded by concrete walls and hurricane fences topped with barbed wire, and also in the surrounding olive groves, where there's no running water, no sanitation, no toilets, no electricity, nothing. And that's how people were living. I describe it in short as a slum inside a prison. That's what it looks like.
So let's meet your co-author and talk about how that happened. You already had this notion, and we'll get to that before we break up, because I want to hear how she goes from journalist to fiction writer, from fiction writer to journalist, which is one of the many things I admire about Helen. You meet Eyad, give me his last name again. Awwadawnan. And life kind of changes for you. His father tells him something incredible. He says, he's from Syria, and he's from near Dera, I think, if I remember rightly, which Lawrence of Arabia made famous. Anyway, he says, don't look for honey in a country that kills its bees. And very quickly, Eyad's family life is falling apart.
Right. So I did go to Greece originally to write a novel, as I mentioned, but when I got there and saw how dire the circumstances were, I felt, the urgent fire to get the message out to the world sooner than a novel could do, and more urgently. My very second day there, I wandered into a stationery shop to buy a map so I could figure out where the hell I was. I'd gone there pretty cold. I was not associated with any organization of any kind, which I did on purpose so that I'd be free to go where and do what I wanted. And there was a young man standing in the shop asking very politely for something in English. And there was just something about him I instantly liked and trusted. So I just accosted him and invited him for coffee. And the stationery shop owner said, don't you think you should explain who you are and what you want? Because I forgot that part. It was just this strange woman invited him for coffee. So I explained that I was researching a book. He said he couldn't meet me right then, but he could the next day. The next day I had an appointment with the camp manager, which had taken me months and months to arrange, inside the camp. Journalists were not allowed in the camp. In fact, journalists were being arrested for going in there. So I went in there with my novelist's hat on, which is how I got in officially. She kept me waiting for an hour and a half in the boiling sun, no shade, and then cancelled the appointment. But while I was waiting, Eyad showed up, greeted me, and introduced me to his Syrian friend, another young man by his side, and said, "This is Hasan. He is a man with no hope." And that's how we first met. And he would like to talk to you. So we went up the mountain, out of sight of the police watching us, and sat down. He told me, asked me to put my notebook away because he was so nervous that we would be seen. And I said, I just want to find out what it's like to live in this camp from day to day. How do you manage from minute to minute living in this camp? How do you get food? How do you sleep? How do you deal with all the crowds and the filth? There's rubbish everywhere. It stank of sewage, rats running around everywhere, snakes, scorpions. And as we talked that first day, Hasan didn't speak English yet. So Eyad was translating from Arabic for me. And at one point Hasan said something, and Eyad said to me, he's asking you to tell his story to the world. Would you please promise to tell his story to the world? And I said, I will do my best. And I really felt I had to keep that promise. And that really, in a way, is what triggered the whole book.
There's something about, I just have to say, as a fellow writer, journalist, the commitment to that kind of multi-year project is extraordinary, especially given that you weren't doing it, at the behest or with the support of a large news organization like an NPR or Washington Post. And not that our news institutions, I think, don't do as well as we can. I'm defending mine. But it's hard. You can't keep going back. You can't spend months. You can't spend weeks. The numbers just don't check out for the most part. No newsroom can really sustain that. And a book like this can. So Hasan, who gives you this almost I alone and left to tell me, call me Ishmael kind of line, I'm a man without hope. I just would like you to tell us how young these people are, because we're not talking about, they may look 40, which is very ancient for them, but they're far from it.
Yeah. Eyad was only 23 when I met him, and Hasan was 25. They didn't know each other before. They had met in the camp. Most of the people in the book are very young. The Afghan young woman, Mursal, she was 21 when I met her. And Evans, who is a gay refugee from Nigeria, escaping the homophobic laws there, he was only 22 when I met him. Then there are a couple of older ones too. But the vast majority of refugees who are trapped in Greece are high school and college age. And one of the tragic things is that their education stops dead as soon as they have to flee the country. They do not go to school in Greece. Greece does not expect it. Little children sometimes get to go for a bit, but high school and up. So everything stops dead and they can't work. So they're just in this terrible limbo.
This purgatory of limbo. And, of course, most people are arriving by sea. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Maybe you heard the news this morning. There was another boat that went down between, the boat went down the Aegean, I think, but the accusations were traded between Italy and France. 47,000 people have drowned trying to reach refuge. Maybe I want to talk about Hasan in a second, but why Greece? Why does the Aegean Sea wind up becoming, what did the Pope call it?
The graveyard of Europe.
And why?
Yeah, because how many thousands, tens of thousands of refugees what you wrote down the number, Jackie?
47,000.
Right, have died since
14.
2014, and just this year there have been more than 2,000. They die because they capsize, because they're on those inflatable rubber dinghies, which is just like a kind of flattened balloon, overcrowded, and because lately Greece has been pushing the coast guards of Europe. This is something a lot of Americans don't know. The Coast Guard of Europe is called Frontex, and the Coast Guard of Greece is the Coast Guard of Greece. They have been pushing refugees back out to sea instead of rescuing them, causing more deaths and drownings among children and women and men. It's really shocking, and I might add to that. I know I'm digressing a little, but what you mentioned first. Just now, Greece, Cyprus, Italy, France, and Malta have made an agreement that they need to stop organizations that rescue refugees at sea. They talk about them as criminals, and they're blaming the so-called refugee crisis on these humanitarians who are saving people from drowning. So it's a very bad picture. But why did I focus on Greece?
Well,
Because it's really the main gateway to Western Europe, especially for Middle Easterners, but also from Africa. If you just look at the geography, many have to go through Turkey to even begin to go west. And the northern Aegean is really, really close to Turkey. In fact, Samos is only 1.5 kilometers off the coast of Turkey. So you could actually swim it if the weather and the currents allowed you. So that's where most people first come, there or Italy. And that's why there's been so much focus from Western Europe on pouring money into Greece to stop the refugees dead right there and stop them coming into Western Europe. And by the way, this, of course, is not being done, I'm just going to say it, to Ukrainian refugees. It's being done to brown and black ones.
Right. So the bottleneck comes right there. So that's the backdrop and the facts. And against that, we'll go back to Hasan, who wants you to write his story. And I can imagine being absolutely fiercely compelled to do just exactly that, especially when you're on your own. And he's kind of a Zelig of disaster. He's not particularly, he's not a saint. Not all refugees are. There's something about the human character. Maybe you need to be, a bit of the Mick to get it yourself into the room. Tell us about him. He's had a number of unfortunate experiences. He would have had a hard time if he'd never been a refugee.
Yeah, I mean, he always he calls himself, I'm just a bad guy, I'm just a bad boy, as a bad son. I mean, he's not a criminal. He's just a kind of
he's a rogue.
He's just naughty. But also in another way very innocent and very generous. But he grew up in a very, very poor family in Manbij, which is right on the border of Turkey and northern Syria. So once the war started, Manbij became a kind of center for all the conflicts between Iran, Turkey, Russia helping Assad. So his town at one point, belonged to Assad, and then it was taken over by the Free Syrian Army, the rebels, and then it was taken over by ISIS, and he got caught up in all of that. But he also gets himself into trouble sometimes too. But the thing about him is that he admits it. And I want to say something about this book I really need people to understand, because Eyad and I approached this book with two really important principles in our minds. One was that we were not going to do the typical Western journalist thing of telling people stories for them. We were going to get out of the way and off the page so they could tell their stories themselves in their own words. I felt this is a white woman from the West, very privileged person, especially strongly. So the book is an odd mixture of literary journalism, if you like, narrative, and oral history. We get off the page, they tell their own story. Of course, we edit and polish it and everything. It's not just a raw transcript. But we really worked on preserving their voices and left the control of how to tell the stories and what to tell in their own hands, which was really important to the people in the book. The other principle was we did not want to do the other thing that journalists do so much, which is just talk about people as refugees, as if their lives started at the border of Europe, or as if they're defined only by the trauma they've gone through in their lives. So each person has 3 chapters. The first one is just about their lives at home, before they had to flee, their childhoods, their memories, their families, their love lives, anything they wanted to tell us. The middle chapter is about the actual flight, these hair-raising journeys they took, and the third chapter for each one is about what happened to them once they hit Greece.
I thought that it really made people, it's riveting to read. It made this so much not a news report, and it gave a lushness to the human experience, which is what people remember when they remember their childhoods. Each one of these, we'll get to the cast of characters in a moment, but Hasan says of his mother, I'm beginning to forget the smell of her, and she has since passed away. And then he also says, for me, Manbij was like Paris. It was a beloved place. So do you want to talk a little bit more about what happened to him, or move on to the next?
I think I would like people to read it for themselves.
All right, then we'll go
I don't
on.
want to give too many spoilers.
Too many spoilers, okay. And then
But he's funny. He's surprising. He has lots of misadventures and it's really extraordinary how much he's been kicked around by life. He has such resilience. Well, he loves social media, by the way. He's all over social media all the time.
Yep, he's already thanked me for the shout out about tonight's reading. So much for the last name. I'm just going to digress a little bit professionally here. There was something in this book that made me think of Working, the Studs Terkel classic, where people tell stories. I started my career in Chicago in their own words. But let's move on to what is her name?
Asmahan.
Asmahan, thank you, who is also a Syrian refugee. Right. And Eyad finds her.
Right. So I started, at first, Eyad was my interpreter and my fixer, as we say in the journalism business, finding me people to interview. And the reason that we segued into being co-authors was because of COVID. I'd been going back to Greece over and over again, and I was going to go there in March 2020, remember that horrible month, and to join them, and we were going to go to some of the most remote, uncovered refugee camps in Greece. And then I couldn't go, but he was still there, and by that time I had seen that he was a beautiful writer and a kind of gifted interviewer who people just open up to. So I said, why don't you interview people you can meet in person in Greece in Arabic, and I'll use WhatsApp to speak to French and English speakers, and we'll divide it up that way. So he got moved, after I first met him, he got moved from the refugee camp in Samos to a refugee camp just north of Thessaloniki on the mainland called Nea Kavala. And there he was in the same shipping container as a 42-year-old woman who was pregnant and struggling on her own. And they passed the time because there's nothing they could do. As I said before, they can't go to school, can't go to work. Just talking and sharing their memories of Syria and telling each other about their lives and their hopes and their dreams. And they became fast friends. And this was happening before we decided on the book. So Eyad said, she's pouring her heart out to me and she wants the world to know her story. So he weaves his own story through the chapter about her and where they overlap and the things that happened to both of them together in the camp, which makes it quite riveting. So that's how Asmahan came into it.
And Asmahan is over 40, but there's another woman in the cast of characters. She's from Afghanistan, and that is Mursal. I really resonated with her story because I went into Afghanistan right as the Taliban fell in 2001 and stayed there a while and then back in 2004 to teach. And she does leave before the fall of Afghanistan, but you met her relatively recently, 2019, I think.
She left in 2019. I met her in 2021.
Sorry, yeah.
She was the one I met most recently. She and her family had were living in a village in the north, and it was controlled by the Taliban. So at that point, the Taliban had control of about a fifth of the country. So they were already, well positioned to take over. But her father worked for Doctors Without Borders. He was a doctor, and the Taliban wanted him to work for them, mending their fighters, and he refused. So they stormed into the house. They beat up him. They beat up the whole family, and they beat up his mother, her Mursal's grandmother, and said, "Next time we're going to come back and kill you." So that's why they had to flee. And the whole family together. She had two little sisters. Walked. They got to Iran through various cars, and then they had to walk over the mountains to Turkey, some of the most hazardous, dangerous mountains in the world, and walked and walked and walked and walked for weeks. Mursal's feet swelled to twice their normal size from the amount of walking, and the whole time she was keeping a journal and keeping it in English. She was a top student always in school. She wanted to be a doctor like her dad. Very studious, very devoted to her studies. So you can imagine how she feels about what's happening to women in Afghanistan now. But when I met her and I said, "I would love you to tell your story in your own words," that was exactly what she wanted to hear. And she said, "Okay, because of that, I'll do it." And by the way, here's my journal. And I said, "Can we incorporate your journal into this?" And she said, yes. So it really is in her own words.
Well, that's why there's one of the many reasons why this is an extraordinary document. And I think it will remain so, because this is a real profile of where we are. And what does it say about us in the Western world that we're treating people like this?
Well, that's a question for us all to ask ourselves. It's been said by various writers and politicians over the years, that how we treat refugees is a reflection of who we are or who we want to be. In fact, Biden gave a speech saying exactly that in 2021. And yet, we are doing very badly, and we're doing worse and worse. Not only in our own borders here, but just today, the new Prime Minister of Britain, my other home country, has made a deal, or his ministers of immigration have made a deal with France to give them $74 million to increase their border patrol security force to arrest people who are trying to cross the channel by boat. Think how many refugees you could help with legal aid and psychological help with $74 million. And yet, the way to fight refugee smugglers isn't to arrest them all and put refugees in detention centers. It's to give them legal, safe ways to cross borders and seek asylum. And this is what's happening everywhere. The EU is pouring millions of euros into Greece for Greece to build closed detention camps, which look exactly like very modern concentration camps. I've seen them, I've been to them, to hold asylum seekers in, who are not criminals, who are exercising their international human right to cross borders however they can and request asylum.
An international human right codified in 1951 by when they set up the United Nations Commission on Refugees, High Commission on Refugees, and you said that this was done to help the Jews after World War II, and at that point, the authorities were just fairly well disposed to immigration. So, even using a word like immigration. You were saying earlier, to call someone a refugee, right, but they're often called much worse, illegal aliens.
Well, it was really done out of a kind of guilt because of how badly Jewish refugees had been treated, right, as they were trying to flee the Nazis, and how often the UK and the US pushed people back, sent them back to their deaths. So there was very much a never again will we do that, which started that convention. Yes, I just wrote a piece for the Columbia Journalism Review pointing out what a mistake it is for the press to constantly use the word migrants, let alone illegal migrants, or as you said, used to be said and is still said in some quarters, illegal aliens, because it is not illegal to cross the border in any way, even if you're breaking local laws. If you're seeking asylum, it is your right. It is not illegal. So we should, if we're talking about asylum seekers, we're talking about people who are fleeing a home they cannot go back to without risking torture, imprisonment, or death, or all three. We are not talking about migrants. And the reason this matters so much is that migrants don't have the legal rights that refugees and asylum seekers do. A migrant is defined as somebody who is, crossing into another country to find a better job. I will say, of course, with climate warming and floods and droughts and everything, and people having to flee because they starving, that gets a little murkier, these definitions. But at the moment, the difference is a migrant is going for economic betterment, and a refugee is going to escape death, torture and imprisonment. And a refugee, asylum seeker, has legal rights because of that, but migrants don't. So it's very useful for the far right and anti-immigrant politicians to use the word migrant, because it suggests to everyone, oh, these people are coming to take my jobs. These people are my enemy.
Right.
So I'm not going to be sympathetic for them. They don't need help.
Right.
And that's exactly the kind of thought process they're trying to evoke.
Piled on with the racism that so many of them encounter. Let's go back to some of the stories. I don't want to neglect Calvin or Evans. These are refugees from African countries, particularly, is it Evans, who, this is where this book really is so different than others that deal with some of the dimensions of this problem, because it begins by Evans falling in love.
Yes, so
he's 15.
When he's 15, he talks about the first boy he fell in love with, and how close they were and how obsessed he was by him. He gets caught in the school. He gets expelled because being LGBTQ.
His parents are horrible.
In Nigeria is illegal and shameful, and is considered by both Muslims and Christians a kind of a devilish, demonic thing to be. So he's beaten up by his teachers, and then he goes home, and his mother has him held down by some strange men, and she tortures him and then disowns him, kicks him out. I actually spoke to quite a few gay refugees who'd gone through exactly that from different countries and different homes. He's there, then there's a warrant for his arrest put out later on. I'm not going to tell you the whole story. And that's why he has to flee Nigeria, and he makes it all the way to Greece by himself. He is trafficked on the way at one point. He has quite a really, really hard time of it. I started interviewing him by WhatsApp. So I discovered that there was a young volunteer from England working on Samos who started a secret LGBTQ support group. It had to be secret because LGBTQ refugees are in such danger from each other. So because a lot of people from their own countries are refugees too for different reasons, and they carry the same prejudices. So they have to hide who they are even among their fellow refugees, which is extra, extra sad, and they are often attacked. And I went to the first support group in person since COVID began. They invited me along. It was secret behind locked doors because it was so dangerous for the people there. And there were 27 people in the room, one from Iran and all the rest from different African countries. And it was for almost all of them the very first such support group they had ever attended in their lives, because the support groups are also illegal at home. It was a very moving experience, as you can imagine. So that chapter also talks about the plight of LGBTQ refugees and the things that are unique for them. But Evans himself, when I finally got to meet him in person, he is the most astonishing young man. He's, I hope this doesn't sound sexist, but he's really beautiful. But he was a professional dancer in Nigeria before he had to flee.
And he loves to dance.
And he's just this sweetest soul. He really is.
And I want to just not neglect Calvin, because he's from Cameroon. And of all the refugees, his memories of his homeland were the most beautiful. I feel like I was reading an Anne Patchett novel about the jungle or something. It was just, he's talking about the forest, and we're people of the forest, and we live amid the trees. And, you know, for a moment I forgot what I was reading and just wondered if I could wander there. It's beautiful, you know.
Yeah, so everybody in the book has this has their own poetry, their own natural poetry. It's one of the reasons we chose them, because they're such good storytellers. If you're going to have an oral history approach, you need people who can really tell a story. And even though a lot of them were speaking English as a second language, they were speaking English, and they had their own poetry in that vernacular, if you like. And also, you know, a lot of my interviews were during COVID, and because they couldn't work, they had a lot of time on their hands. And that was to my benefit. They were able to talk to me for hours and hours and hours and hours, week after week, month after month, year after year.
Well, in fact, he talks about his tribal language that he uses, and that is a sort of a subset within a subset. You know, you've really learned things in this book about you know, the human race and all the different places from which we come. But in the end, they do have to flee for reasons of oppression and threats to their lives and intolerance. And we're not talking about not getting invited to a party. We're talking about, you know, getting repressed to death. So once they do leave, once they do fetch up, once you encounter them, you begin to have this very granular connection with them over the course of the last couple of years, because, you know, COVID has to slow things down. What did you learn, you know, as a writer and journalist? How could we be doing better by these folks?
Yes, that it was important to have the final chapter about what we can do to help, so that the readers aren't left dangling, feeling all helpless and hopeless. So there's a section about what we can do politically and the policy-wise, and what the EU should be doing and that kind of thing, which is better for you to read than for me to recite, I think. But then there's also what we can do as individuals. And I mean, there are the obvious things like donating and volunteering, but there are also organizations where you can just invite a refugee to tea or for dinner, or you can go or read stories to a child in a camp. There are detention centers all around in our backyards in this country. There are many ways, but I think the most important one, which was said by Eyad to me, he said the most important thing for us, the thing that makes the biggest difference in our lives, is just being made to feel welcome. Just a smile, an act of kindness. If you see somebody on the street who, you know, is maybe a Venezuelan, in New York subways I've seen Venezuelans now begging, you know, just a kind word, a smile. It makes, it sounds sentimental, but when you're on the receiving end of nothing but spitting and contempt and ugliness, it makes a huge difference.
Well, it doesn't sound sentimental to me when you have people who are, you know, treated as chattel by the likes of an Abbott or DeSantis, and none of that seemed to come up in the glowing reports of, you know, what a great Republican candidate he was going to be. So I think, you know, the dehumanization, that crosses borders, you know, the whole collective sense of it. How many of these people wind up having stable homes and outcomes? What percentage?
Through the whole globe, all the refugees in the world, only 2%.
Which is staggering. And the notion of what can we do to change humanitarian visas, for example? Could we change the visa situation? What can countries do?
Oh, there's so much. I mean,
It's a long section.
A lot of the bureaucracy that has been set up is unnecessary. A lot of it is to slow things down. Of course, when Trump was in power, he put in at least 100 little changes, laws here and there that clogged it and clogged it and clogged it, so that you have to wait much longer than you have to. And it's Biden has made some big mistakes and let us down in many ways, but in other ways we blame him too much, because dismantling 100 little laws takes a long time. In Europe, one of the effects of this deal that the EU made in 2016 with Turkey and Greece to trap refugees, was to declare Turkey a safe country. So now refugees have to go through, I should say asylum seekers, 2 interviews. The first to see whether it's safe to send them back to Turkey. They have to prove it's not safe to be sent back to Turkey before they can have their real asylum interview. And the wait for these interviews, by the way, can be for years. And this has gone longer and longer and longer. And that's been done deliberately. So, if you're clogging up things deliberately, you can unclog them deliberately too.
Absolutely.
If there's the will.
And of course, there's the whole value added that that newcomers to any of these countries, which are losing population in Europe and throughout, I think, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, that these people come to work. They come to produce. They come to flourish. They want to go to school. They want to have stable lives, and they want to contribute. That so gets turned on its head in this devilish situation. I want to give you time there's something you'd like to read that kind of concludes things. And then we're going to take questions from the audience.
So I was talking about, is this working?
Doesn't sound right. It just...
I'll project. I was talking about how the book is, and so much of the book is in their words.
Why don't you go?
So, a sample. I'm going to read a little bit from Mursal, the Afghan. We were talking about, because this is really written to all of us. Remember, she's 21, and she just had her great dream of her life to become a doctor cut short. And by the way, she's now working as an interpreter for Doctors Without Borders and supporting her entire family. Do you know about refugees' dreams? If our country was at peace, we would never leave. No one wishes to live in a tent or a camp. Everyone loves their home. Unfortunately, the Taliban came to our city and started fighting. Right before we left our country, we waited for the new year to come, but our new year opened with war and the sound of bombs, not with balloons. That night we had no dinner, only tears. We come here to Europe because we hope to give our children a good life and a future. We want to wake up to the sound of clocks, not bombs. We want to sleep without fear. We want to hear only the sounds of our family's laughter. We sold our home and everything we owned. Now we do not have anything. I hope one day we can find someone who loves and supports us, who will talk to us, not hate us. Refugees are not bad people. Please stop hating us. Just put yourself in our place. How would you feel if you were insulted every day on the bus? Would you be patient? If you look, you will see we are like you. Some people see refugees as homeless, nameless, unclean, uneducated, and criminal. Yes, we are homeless, but not hopeless. We are nameless, but not weak. If we are unclean, it's because we slept in the forest streets and tents, but we have clean hearts. If our crime is speaking up for our rights and freedom, yes, we are criminals. If you do not want to see any refugees or migrants, fine, but please do not insult us. Sometimes only one word or action from you can make us feel as if our whole life is a jail. My mum always tells me, just calling someone a donkey does not make them a donkey. Calling us bad and unclean does not make us bad and unclean. Being a refugee means you are strong. You pass through a difficult, dangerous journey and still you are alive. You have hope. You have goals and dreams. As my mum also says, when you find yourself in a bad situation, just remember this. After every dark night, a beautiful morning will come.
Thank you, Helen. That was lovely. Thank you so much. And now we'd love to hear from you. If you have questions, the traditional method here at Politics and Prose is to come up to this microphone over here to the side. And don't everybody be shy, because I'm sure that one or two of you have a question you might like to ask. We'll start with Mr. Finn.
Yeah. Hi, Helen.
Hi, Peter.
I guess I'm most curious, which is a kind of journalistic dilemma. You meet these people, you become intimate with their lives, and then where does that leave them? So I'm curious where the subjects of your book are and your co-author are now, and if their lives have improved in any way as a result of the experience of working with you.
Okay, that's a lot of questions in one. I'm still in touch with all of them. The book, because it was rushed out, because the publisher felt it was so urgent, so it actually goes up to this year. So there's in the epilogue, there's a little catch-up of what's happened to everybody up until a few months ago. But I'm still in touch with all of them, so their lives are continuing to evolve, of course. I have not separated from them emotionally. I don't know if I ever will, and I'm not sure I need to. It's not as if there are hundreds of them. In fact, I hope to stay friends with them forever. I think for Eyad, of course, it's made a huge difference. He's become an author. He was in law school in Damascus when he was forced to flee, but he'd always been a writer. He'd always written poetry. He'd always had a dream of being a writer. And when we first met, he gave me a piece that he'd written about his flight from Syria, which his asylum lawyer told might help his case. So he asked me just to check over. The lawyer had translated it, but she wasn't a writer. If I check over the English, and I read it, and I was blown away because it was so beautiful. So I asked him for permission to polish it up a bit more, and I sent it around, and Slate magazine published it as their cover story. What's happened to my voice, sorry. And that was thrilling for him. And now he's a co-author, so that was thrilling, and he's still, so what's happened to him is after 5 years of struggling in Greece with his family, their whole family came over, an enormous family, he has 9 siblings, struggled for 5 years to get asylum. He tried to leave Greece illegally, on a legal passport 7 times because he was getting so stifled there, got arrested every time. Finally, his father managed to get their Syrian passports, and on their Syrian passports, the whole family went to Iceland, perhaps the last kind country left on the west, and that's where they now have asylum. And he is applying to university to go to journalism school. So he has a very happy story. Some of them are still knocking around. Some of them are still trapped in Greece. Some of them are still struggling to find jobs, to find their way. None of them have gone back to school yet, not any of them. But it's meant a lot to them to be in this book. And one of the reason they wanted to be in the book goes right back to what you were saying earlier, Jacki, about the demonization of refugees that we're hearing everywhere. they really want to push back against this, and they felt the way to push back against that was by just saying, look at me, I'm a complete human being like you, and this is with the same loves and cares and flaws and humor and craziness as anybody has. I am not here to to undermine your culture. I'm not here to change your religion. I'm not here to steal your jobs. I'm not here to live off the fat of the land. I'm here because I need to make a life for me and my family, and is free of persecution. And because if I go home, they'll kill me. And that's really the essence of why everybody's in the book. So they're proud. They're really proud of being in the book, and it's a lovely feeling. We're like a partnership altogether about this. It's very different than the usual journalist-source relationship that we have when we're doing daily journalism and we're parachuting in and out of people's lives. It's very different. So I broke all kinds of rules that I teach. I got a lot of former students in my school.
You can do that when you're writing a book.
It is different with books. But there's something else too, which is that, and I'm sure a lot of you know this with your own work, when you're working with people who are living right on the edge, you can't not help them sometimes. Like if a phone call or a few dollars can make the difference between sleeping on the street or in a house, eating or not eating, being thrown in jail or not being thrown in jail, being deported or not being deported, you have to do something. If you're going to live with yourself, you have to do something. So there's that too.
Right. Very true. And if you just say your name before you ask a question. Thanks.
David.
Hey, David,
I think
how
we
are
may
you?
have met
We
once or
might
twice.
have met a few times.
So I think it's an amazingly beautiful principle, this idea of getting out of the way, getting off the page, letting people tell their own stories. At the same time, of course, I know you're a fiction writer at heart in some ways, as well as a journalist at heart. Do you think any of this is going to work its way into fictional projects going forward? Or do you feel like you just can't, that's you've taken that off the table?
It's called The Good Deed, and it's coming out in a year and a half.
Oh, I swear I didn't set that up intentionally, but yeah.
Remember I mentioned that I went there originally to research a novel, and I did write that novel, and I wrote it before I did this book. So it's kind of the other way around. Usually I write the non-fiction first, and if there's still something more to say, that's what I did with the Iraq War books. I feel like the non-fiction, I can't get into people's hearts deep enough. That's when I go to fiction. In this case, they were very different projects, even though the novel is set on Samos and is about two Syrians and a Sudanese woman who live there, and an American woman who is there as a tourist and gets her life all tangled up with theirs. But yeah, so...
Right, something
and
to look
Eyad
forward
helped
to.
me a lot with the novel. He read every word. Yeah.
Well, I'll be looking forward to that.
Hi, I'm John. Hi, let's address the big elephant in the room. Compassion fatigue and limited resources. I mean, every time I see a homeless person, like panhandlers, I feel sorry for them, but I have limited resources. I go to animal shelter to see dogs and cats begging to be adopted. You can't adopt them all. What can you really do? The stories that break my heart, but what can you really do? I give charity to give money to charities for help homeless. I don't give panhandlers on the street. I don't know what the money is going to, but can you address the big elephant in the room?
Sure. I think it's, I'm quoting my husband on this, who said this a long time ago, there's a do-gooders disease, which is that we never feel we can do enough. And if you go down that path too far, then you don't do anything because you feel paralyzed. You have to learn to be happy with, it's enough to help one person. It's enough to help 4 people. You've done more than most people will do. And it doesn't have to be about money if you don't have money. You can volunteer to read to children, as I said, or to help teach them English, or you can have them to tea, or you can give them a seat on the bus and be nice and say, welcome. If that's the most you can do. But you have to be careful not to whip yourself with the feelings that we all have that you just expressed, because that does lead to paralysis.
Yes. I mean, understand the European country situation. You can't get them all in and be the flood, like basically to stabilize the society. I mean,
Actually, to tell the truth, if you look at the world, only 1 out of every 300 people is a refugee. So if theoretically people were distributed more evenly, we wouldn't even notice. So the idea that we're being flooded and overwhelmed is vastly exaggerated. Most refugees settle within their countries. They're displaced people. But most people who leave their countries settle near their countries. The vast majority of refugees in the world are living in the poorest countries in the world. The rich West and the US take in the fewest of anywhere else, like 2%, 1%. It's shocking. We have plenty of room. Also, as Jackie mentioned, in Europe, most countries are losing populations. They need people to come and work. So it's the crisis is the refugee crisis isn't about numbers. It's about our own moral crisis, which to quote David Miliband.
but how do you address like this? As you know,
There's a couple more questions,
Okay,
so let's move on.
Human beings are tribal. I mean, just why? How do you respond to people like saying, why don't the rich Muslims can help the refugees out, like Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates? How do you address that question?
Okay, well, let's park that and take a couple more
Sure,
people,
okay,
because
cool.
it's almost 8 o'clock.
Okay.
Thank you so much. My name is Julie. So my question is related to when you talked about the person working in the camp that didn't show up to let you in and you had a tough time accessing the camp. So within the people that are working in the refugee camps, how did you find them? What drives them, especially given the lack of funding and resources that people are working under? Thank you.
Well, okay, it's a good question. So the camp was run by Greece with some help from the UN, but the people who worked in the camp officially are Greek, and it's very much like the population you see working as prison guards. You know, the economy is terrible in Greece, unemployment's very high. So to most of the people I met who worked in the camp, including the camp manager herself, had this attitude, it's just a job. And they were very resentful towards the refugees and mostly very unkind with some exceptions. Then there are the NGOs who come in, people come in from all over Europe and America and Australia, to volunteer and help the refugees outside. This particular camp manager wouldn't let any NGOs work inside the camp. They all had to be in town. And then the Greek government passed a law a couple of years ago declaring that any NGO that worked with refugees had to be of a certain size, and everybody who worked there had to be completely vetted. So they managed to kick out almost all the smaller, really best refugee NGOs, and so there was almost nobody left to help. But that was the situation. So the way the refugees felt treated by the people working in the camp was pretty awful.
All right, it is now 8 o'clock. I think it's been a really good discussion, and I'm so honored that I had a chance to talk to you about this remarkable and really incredible feat of both reportage and oral storytelling. So, and thank Eyad for us, won't you? We'll look forward to seeing him here sometime. Great to have everyone come out tonight on a Monday night after the election. Thank you so much for joining us, and Helen will sign books now.
Thanks, everyone.